All right, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Food Systems Resiliency Webinar Series. My name is Lynn Schmidt-McQuitty, and I am the Strategic Initiative Leader for Healthy Families and Communities within the Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the University of California. And along with my colleague, Dr. Deanne Meyer, who's the Strategic Initiative Leader for Sustainable Food Systems, we're really happy that you're able to join us today. Just a few kind of reminders before we actually kick off with our presenters. We want you to be reminded that we are recording this session so that we can use it in the future for promotion and educational purposes. And we will be muting you throughout in order to prevent that background noise. If you have questions, we would appreciate it if you could use the Q&A box, and we will then provide some time at the end of the formal session to address the questions and answers. However, if you have non-questions or comments, you can also then use the chat box so that we can communicate with you. So if you have technical issues or things along like that line that you need to communicate with us, please use the chat box. And then for the chat box, remember that you have two options. You can use the panelists if you only want to talk to the speakers, or everyone if you want to share your chat with everyone. So if you could remember those two things, that would be really helpful to us. Next slide, please. So our series is really prompting people to reimagine our food system through all aspects, whether it's on the processing end, the production end, or the accessibility end. You realize that it's a very fragile system and that we're bringing this series together in order for people to learn and build partnerships in order to continue to address a healthy food resiliency, healthy food system resilient, a food system that is resilient to change. Excuse me. Next slide. Our objectives are really to improve knowledge and understanding, identify and share available resources. So post-webinar, we will have a resource kit available for people to utilize and to gather information from based upon the presentations. Also to identify information gaps, brainstorm, and also recruit additional participants to either projects or applied research projects that you might be interested in. Next slide, please. Next session on the 4th August, on the 4th Tuesday of August, on the 25th, will be on the beef supply chain and market disruptions that have taken place during COVID-19. So that will be our next session on August 25th from 10 to 11. So feel free to join us as well. Next slide. I'm really happy to introduce our panel today. 3 distinguished speakers from the University of California Cooperative Extension, all locally based academics working in the field. We have Larry Ferrero from Shasta County, Dan Macon from Placer, Nevada, Sutter, and Yuba counties, and Vince Trotter from Marin County. So without further ado, I'd like us to kick it off with Larry.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Just a handful of slides associated with niche beef marketing and maybe provide a little insight into can be really challenging to have locally produced meat products. Next slide. And when you think about California in general, we're a long ways from processing. Most of the beef cattle that are produced in California are going to be shipped at the end of the grass season, be it fall or late spring, and they're gonna probably go to the Midwest where the feedlots and the packing plants are concentrated. Although there is a significant number of cattle go into the Northwest where they're fed in and processed in Washington. So typically in California, we think about harvesting the grass with a ruminant, in this case beef cattle, and then they're finished out of state. Next slide, please. So this niche meat marketing, it's certainly not a new idea. It's something that A&R has worked on and worked with producers for a number of years, and I think there is some potential for market growth. Some folks are interested in developing their own label so their products differentiated in the marketplace. There are opportunities, and I think they're different, and the speakers today, I believe, will address this, where localized and regional marketing can occur, and I think there's different opportunities based upon the market that the producer is selling into. And then the last bullet, the COVID-19 has provided some opportunity for folks where all of a sudden people are more interested in where their meat comes from, and probably have had some concerns over shortages of meat in their retail outlets. Next slide, please. I think the key to this is knowing the target consumer. And I think the market has to be based on something other than if I produce it, they'll buy it. Just feeling like, yeah, I can do this and people are going to come to me to buy this product may result in disappointing response. I think it's really critical to research costs, returns, and customer preferences, and then understand potential problems and have a plan to address them. If you've got stored meat in the freezer and the power goes out, is your welder going to have enough amperage, produce enough watts to where you can start it, plug those freezers in, and know that your product is going to be safe? Next slide, please. So the thought with regard to consumer preferences, here's 4 ribeye steaks from 4 different vendors. The upper left is a grass-fed. The upper right is a locally produced grain-fed. Lower left is a higher-end retail product, and the bottom right is a product that's available at a discount grocery store. So what do folks want? When you look at them, if people might think they have an affinity for grass-fed beef, but if they've never tried it, they may not know that. And it was interesting, a blind test, sample size of 1, 0 degrees of freedom. The individual that I did a blind taste test on these chose the steak in the upper right hand square, and didn't care for the grass-fed at all. So again, knowing your customer's preference, really what they want, not necessarily what they say they want, is going to be key. And I think doing some samplings and taste tests to understand that's going to be critical. Next slide. Questions from customers. The fella that's sitting in the reclining chair in the recliner is a longtime friend of mine. Made a living in the meat business as both working in large industrial packing houses, and later opened his own custom shop. And he was always kind of funny because one question he got a lot was, "Hey, I bought this 1,250 pounds beef, and all I got is this meat that's in essentially in four boxes. Where'd the rest go? Did you steal some of my steaks?" The second bullet, "How much do I owe you? That seems like a lot." And he always told me, "I can't do it for free." And the last bullet was kind of a funny deal. I was in his shop one day and he answered the phone and responded, "Hello, Thayers. Nope, we're the most expensive. You don't want to come here." And when he hung up, I said, "Don, how about a little customer service ethic? And, talk about the quality of your product and the value in it." And he said, "Nope, if they're already trying to be cheap, I don't want them as customers." And I think that was key. He knew who his customers were and who he wanted. Next slide. So when you really look at how much meat you get out of a 300 or a 300-pound side of beef, which would be a 600-pound carcass, this would be the hind quarter. You look down in the bottom center column, it says 144 pounds. We'll take 43.5 pounds off of that. That's going in the bone, fat, and shrink barrel. And so really 100 pounds of meat in that hind quarter. Next slide. That's going to go into the freezer. Front quarter, 38.1 pounds is going to go in the waste barrels, and a total of about 110 pounds, 115 pounds of meat. So you add those two sides together and it's less than 300 pounds that coming off of that side. Next slide. So this is a cost study, and Deanne and Lynn have provided you this link. I just circled one particular note where in this cost study, which was prepared in 2017, it notes that the processing cost was $100 a head. I just had a bunch of steers processed over at Redwood Meats in Eureka, $175, and a chunk of that is Redwood's charge to get rid of offal. So those costs have gone up. Next slide. So this is a ranging analysis, and it just shows if you hold all the costs the same and you change the income, how does that change the bottom line? And so if you slip across to if you slip across to the fourth column, the center column, where it says 627, 20 head, and $3.75 a pound, you move down that, and when you get to the bottom of that column, you see $1,000. Thank you very much, Rachel. You see $1,000. That's the net revenue above total costs. If you divide 1,000 by 20 head, the resulting number is going to be $50. $50 a head would be the income based on a $3.75 a pound carcass price when you're selling halves of beef. So $50 a head is over cost is what the estimated return would be. And you can see if price goes up, you can see that those numbers move up. Those numbers move up significantly. If the price per pound goes down, you can see they move down into the negative territory. If that changes from 20 head to 19 head because one dies, you can see that would affect the bottom line as well. Next slide. So just to give a quick current example, a half of a choice side of beef, just purchased it 2 weeks ago, was $3.98 a pound, carcass weight into the freezer. 700 pound carcass weight, 350 pound would be a 350 pound side, $3.98 a pound, $1,393 a side, or $2,786 a head gross return. So that's a competitive product locally. And if someone was interested in producing beef to sell locally, that's sort of what the local market is. Next slide. So a couple of simple and free resources. This is one that was developed by Glenn Nader, myself, Roger Ingram, Stephanie Larson on niche beef production. Lots of the ins and outs, discussions on risk, lot of discussion on you got to have a business plan, make sure that the math works. And on the right-hand side is the cost study that I referred to earlier. I think these are pretty handy documents. I suggest, downloading and going through it. If you have any questions, please, give me a call. I'm not very hard to find. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. Oh, and thanks, Rachel. Last slide. Location matters. Processing plant. Scheduling is tough. If you want something processed, you've got to talk to the plants well in advance because shortage of capacity in California. And then the market you're selling into. I think Vince is going to talk to you a little bit about selling into a Marin County market versus a Shasta County market. There's definitely different levels of income. Costs are key. Got to understand transportation, inventory management and storage, and then correct liability insurance. So thank you.
Thank you, Larry. I'd like to introduce Dan Macon next. Dan?
Well, good morning, and it's always nice to follow Larry because I think the groundwork's been well laid. Thank you, Larry. Just to give you a little bit of background, I'm both the livestock and natural resources advisor here in the foothills, but my family and I spent about 10 years direct marketing, primarily lamb, some other meat products here in our area. And so that experience kind of informs my slides today. Next. I think it's interesting that Larry and I have similar slides, just different species to introduce the topic. And I think like most of what we do in extension, there's a short answer and a long answer to this question, but it all comes down to it is a pretty complicated system. And we'll walk through at least a few thoughts on how complicated it might be. Next. So I think when we talk about the food system, especially with respect to meat, it's really important to think about goals. And I think different segments of the food system may have slightly different, if overlapping, goals. Economic efficiency is certainly something we want to think about in terms of our food system, but we also want to think about equity. Equity for folks that want to consume the product, but also for the folks that are doing the work of raising and marketing and processing the product. We need to think about value within the system and who is receiving that value, and is there some balance in that. I think a big question that we had when we were marketing meat was choice. Even with something as small as a lamb, which will fit in the top freezer on your refrigerator, as opposed to the boxes of beef that Larry was talking about, we would frequently have customers call and want just a rack of lamb for that weekend, or just a couple of packages of loin chops. And it's a very different system when you're buying directly from the producer as opposed to a meat market or a grocery store. And then I think we're all talking about resilience in light of the COVID-19 issues that we've experienced. And what does that mean? Are we trying to focus on resilience at the production level, or at the processing level, or at the retail and marketing level? Next. So from a rancher perspective, and Larry really talked about this in his cost study, but I think we really need to look at the meat business separately from our livestock businesses. If we're going to sell meat, we need to know who our customers are and who our consumers are. And they're not always going to be the same person. If you're selling to a restaurant, their motivation as your customer may be very different than the folks that come and eat your product at their restaurant. To give you an example of this, if you're selling loin chops, for example, to a restaurant, and you're a small niche producer as we were, the restaurant's going to want every one of those loin chops to be exactly the same size and shape. That's difficult to do when you're marketing 10 lambs at a time. You're going to get the tail end of that loin, or maybe a center cut of that loin, and it's going to be difficult to control the portion size in that regard. A couple of definitions from an economic perspective to walk through, kind of to flesh out the example that Larry provided. Most of us are familiar with the term gross revenue, but if we think about the direct or variable costs, those are the expenses that vary directly with the number of units that we're producing or selling. And I'll walk through some examples of those as well. And then obviously any business has overhead costs as well, or fixed costs. And those are the expenses that we incur regardless of how many we're producing. So we do need to know a few things about our product. And Larry kind of walked through this example with beef. Total retail product is not the hot carcass weight or dressed weight of the animal. It's the amount of meat in the package. And whether we're selling wholes or halves, or selling by the piece at a farmer's market, or through a community supported ag program, a subscription program, we really have to know what that retail yield is. We also need to have some sense of what the retail yield of those primal cuts are. What percent will be the high-end middle meats like racks or ribeyes? What percent will be the lower priced end meats, whether that's chuck or round, or in the case of lamb, shoulder primarily. And then we also need to understand what our average retail price per pound is. That's easy to do if we're selling a whole or a half animal, but if we're piecing that out, we're getting, for example, $18 or $19 a pound for rack of lamb and $7 a pound for shoulder, we need to know how that averages out in terms of an average retail price per pound. And I think it's also important to remember in this analysis and in pricing our products that there is an upper limit. We may have the best story and the best product available, but very few people are going to spend $150 on a leg of lamb at the farmer's market on Saturday morning. And so there is kind of some upper limit to what we can charge. Next, please. So to walk through the kind of economic analysis that we help producers go through, and certainly we went through in our own business, we first looked at what our gross revenue was. And we looked at how much retail product per head we could expect times our average price per pound to get the total revenue per head. And then we can look at that as a one animal basis or per load or per batch that we're processing at a time. And I'll come back to that idea here in just a second. Then we look at our direct costs or our variable costs. Processing obviously is a big one there. We pay so much per head for slaughter and cut and wrap services. If you're doing your own label, you'll have a labeling cost as well to print and apply those labels. But because we're treating this as a separate business from the ranch business, from the livestock business, we also put a live animal value in there. And Larry's cost study does that as well. So what we started looking at was really what is the net value of the live animal if I sell it live? What's the value I would get if I took a load of lambs to the sale? And that is what the meat business then, at least on paper, has to pay for the live animal from the livestock business. We talk a lot about added value in terms of meat production, and this is the economic analysis that we go through to determine whether or not we're actually adding value. All right, next slide, please. Our overhead costs, then our labor. Certainly there's labor in our time to and from the processor, our labor in marketing, managing inventory, all of those things that we have to do regardless of the number of animals that we're processing. We also count transportation as overhead because it costs the same to pull a full trailer as it costs to haul one animal. And I'll come back to how that plays into this as well. And then we also have storage and marketing costs. Now storage, you might say you'll need more storage the more animals you're doing, and that's certainly true. But there's some minimum level of storage that you're going to have to pay for, and that really is an overhead cost. So the basic equation is to take that gross revenue and subtract our direct expenses, which gives us what we call our gross margin. And that tells us whether or not if we have a positive gross margin there, it tells us kind of what we need to do to fix the business if we're still not covering overheads. From that, we subtract our overheads and we calculate whether we've received a profit or a loss. Next slide. So I think one of the things that we realized, it takes me a while to figure this out, took me probably 10 years to figure this out, was that there really are economies of scale involved even in a niche marketing endeavor. In our business, if I process and market one lamb at a time, I'm actually $400 worse off than I would have been selling that live lamb at the auction, because I spend all of that additional time and money to get the live animal put into packages and converted into a product that I can sell. Now, if I can take 20 lambs at a time, then I'm adding about $28 a head in value over selling the live animal at the auction. And so really it comes down to processing enough units at once to cover all of those overhead costs. So really the moral of the story for us became it's not worth going to our processor with less than a full trailer. That we wanted to make sure that we had the ability to market that many animals at once to cover our overhead. Next slide, please. So a couple of final questions, and Larry touched on this, but I think this is a big one here in California. Are you set up to raise finished animals? A lot of the cow-calf producers here in the foothills do exactly what Larry described, where they're going to sell calves off of grass and they're going to go someplace else to be finished. We found that we had to have the very highest quality pasture available to finish lambs on, which meant that we had lower quality pasture for our breeding animals, and we couldn't run as many breeding animals because of that. I think Vince will talk about this some in the next segment, but how are you going to market? Is it by the piece or by the whole or the half? How many animals do you need to process at a time is one question, but then you also need to think about how long it will take you to market that much meat. Cash flow is a huge issue for most of these businesses. Can you afford that drain on your cash flow in order to add value? And then can you afford to wait to get paid until your meat business has marketed the entire animal? Having a whole freezer full of lamb shoulder roasts doesn't do much to add to your profitability. And then I really think we need to consider some other ways to get at this, whether it's alliances or cooperatives or selling to a larger direct marketer. I think we do focus a lot on the processing end of things, and there's certainly some things we can consider in terms of processing. But for us, the bottleneck was always on our ability to spend enough time selling the product. And I think that's something we can think about as a community food system. And I think that's it, except for some links. Next, yeah. So I've done a fair bit of blogging about this, and there are some other resources on here through the Foothill Farming website that folks might find of value as well. And thank you for the opportunity to be on this today.
Thank you so much, Dan. Our final panelist this morning is Vince Trotter. And Vince, take it away.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be here and just bringing up the rear with a couple of things that I want to add. From my perspective here in Marin County, mostly I'm going to focus on two alternative methods. If we go to the next slide here, and I think that Dan was just mentioning that oftentimes there's a lot of attention focused on the processing side, and the marketing and sales needs equal attention. These two methods that I'm going to focus on here are very focused on processing, which in this moment has come under a lot of scrutiny. And in particular, these are two methods of potentially stepping outside of what we'll call the mainstream methods of processing and therefore converting livestock to a marketable product. And then if we have time, I'll talk about a third pathway that's a little bit further downstream. And I think it's important to kind of note, Dan was highlighting a lot of the elements of resiliency that, kind of get considered in a moment like this. And certainly, I think what I'm talking about and what Dan and Larry were talking about largely focus on this idea of diversification. It's been a method or a message coming out of Extension for a while now, that a rancher who has multiple market streams or multiple enterprises within their operation is better able to withstand shocks to their business. I think that as we talk about resiliency in the food system as a whole, some of these alternatives that we're talking about here represent resiliency, not just for the rancher, but also for the food system as a whole, because they ensure that as shocks to the system occur, the stream of meat to consumers is able to sort of bounce back, remain stable. So let's see, we've got, let's go ahead and jump into the first one, ranch harvested livestock. And I think if you go to the next slide, we're gonna do a poll here. I'm curious to know, those of you who work with ranchers, how many know folks that sell shares, hog shares or freezer beef. And in particular, we're talking about folks that have an animal on the ranch that is harvested there at the ranch, and then the carcass is transported to a local custom meat operation, and then the customer picks up those cuts there. This is a little bit different from, for example, hauling an animal to an inspected plant, and then that carcass is broken down into cuts, but rather this is about ranch harvest. And I'm not sure if we're seeing any folks, but go ahead and answer if you know ranchers that do this as part of their business. So So kind of an even split there between those that do and don't. Around here and in some of the northern counties, it's extremely common. You see this where folks are selling whole or half of a beef or other animals, but historically, technically, it's been illegal. And that changed as of last year when a new law was passed that allowed cattle ranchers to do just this. It opened up a pathway for them to sell 5 animals per month, have those harvested on the ranch and then broken down at the local custom meat shop. And so I want to just walk through that pathway from an opportunity and an obstacle perspective. So if we go to the next slide, for ranchers that are doing this, I think that the opportunity it presents is for them, if they already have a direct relationship with their consumers, it's a different way to serve those consumers. And for those who currently aren't doing direct sales, it is perhaps a slightly easier way to start building relationships with household consumers rather than going through some kind of intermediary. It has within it the potential for a lower processing cost. Both, Dan talked about the transportation and how that comes into play, whether it's one animal or a whole load. In this case, you're not having to take them off of the ranch. And then processing costs typically are also lower outside of that USDA inspected environment. For a lot of ranchers, I think this appeals because of the sense that they stay in control of it. The animal is under their care the entire time. They have that direct relationship with the consumer. They're not trying to meet the schedule of a processor in the same way that maybe if you're hauling 4 hours to a plant and you've got to hit a minimum load, they potentially, in this case, have a greater sense that it's all under their direction. You don't have to maintain an inventory of cuts. So the storage of, Dan mentioned, if you've got a whole bunch of meat sitting there unsold, that's not helping your cash flow or your profitability. In this case, there's no inventory maintenance for the rancher because the carcass, once the animal is harvested on the ranch, goes to the custom meat shop. And at that point, the rancher's out of the picture. And then I think for a lot of folks, there's a sense that that animal is better off being harvested on the ranch rather than spending time in the trailer getting to the plant. But it's not for everyone. And certainly part of that is that not everyone is equipped to take a whole side of beef, even a quarter. Not everyone wants a whole lamb, as Dan was talking about, and Larry touched on the need to know your customers, right? In our area here, there's, and I think this is pretty consistent elsewhere, sort of the standard consumer is looking for a lot of choice. They want a particular cut at a particular time. And it's a much narrower band of consumers that want to take a whole animal with all the varying cuts and the high percentage of grind that potentially comes with that. In a more rural area, generally folks are better equipped to take large chunks of meat and a whole carcass broken down. In urban areas, folks generally don't even have the storage for that, even if they were inclined. The one thing I'll say is that I think we're in a moment where folks on the consumer end are leaning more towards those models, simply because people are looking to make fewer trips to the store. And so the idea of putting a larger bolus of meat aside has, I think, a little bit of renewed appeal. But other obstacles for ranchers in this is that it is what I call a higher touch transaction. You have to find that consumer who is open to this whole animal or a partial animal purchase. There's certain administrative and record keeping elements that go into this, not the least of which is organizing a brand inspection and then making sure that the customer understands that there's going to be, and Larry broke this down really nicely, there's going to be a difference between the weight of that animal on the hoof and what comes to the consumer when they head to the meat shop and pick up their cuts. So there's a degree of communication and understanding that it behooves a rancher to take care of. The law that opened up this pathway for cattle ranchers does have a limit on volume. It's 5 head a month. So this isn't something, again, that you're going to build an entire business around. It's a form of diversification. It's an additional pathway to add to an existing enterprise. And then with it comes limits on species, right? So this law only applies to cattle. And there's been talk of writing law for the state of California that would open up that opportunity for lamb and hogs and goats, but we're not there yet. So again, this doesn't work for everyone, but for some, it can have a lot of appeal, and it can be a form of diversification that takes an element of the rancher's business out of that USDA inspected stream and allows them to establish a customer base. If we go to the next slide, on-farm poultry processing is an inquiry that comes to me on a regular basis. I'm wondering how many of you get inquiries from folks who want to start harvesting poultry and selling them. Maybe they've heard there's an exemption, they've heard they can do this, and they want to know how. I get probably 1 or 2 a month, sometimes from well outside of Marin County, because we've done a little bit of work around this. Let's go ahead and see, for those of you who are working with ranchers in other places, is this something that comes up a lot for you? We'll take a look. Okay, so that's interesting. We and some of my colleagues in surrounding counties get a lot of inquiries about this. I'm surprised the number isn't higher, but I'm going to walk you through just with the ranch harvested livestock. We'll just talk for a second about poultry processing, and if we go to the next slide, some of the opportunities are similar to before. You get a chance to build a direct line to your consumers, and in part that's because this model does not allow you to sell to restaurants. It doesn't allow you to sell to retailers and distributors. So you have to have a direct connection to your consumers. There are potentially lower processing costs, but you know, Larry and Dan have done a really nice job of talking about the economic analysis that a rancher needs to do in order to determine if this is the right model for them. Something you routinely see is that ranchers don't consider the value of their own time. And if you're going to be processing the birds, you might think that it's more profitable because you're not properly valuing your time as the rancher. Generally speaking, the lower costs to on-farm processing come in transport, and then also as you develop efficiencies, there are just systems that you can implement that are different enough and bring the overall cost down. Also, there's an element of improved animal welfare, and like before, a sense of control for the rancher, that they keep the animal under their control and they are in charge of the process from start to finish. It's definitely not for everyone. Under the obstacles, we're talking about the sweet spot. If you are just getting started as a poultry producer and you can't hit the minimums for a USDA inspected plant or a California state inspected plant, this can be a great way to get rolling, build a customer base. But many ranchers find as they scale up and that customer demand grows, they start to think that it'd be nice to just drop those birds off and let somebody else do it. So what's the right size of operation where you get efficiencies that this starts to pay off, but you don't start to feel like this is a burden? It's also a real skill, not just to kill and clean a bird, but to do so in a way that's appealing to the consumers. Larry, showed those 4 cuts of meat and talked about, what a customer preferred from the 4. It does not take much to turn off a consumer from a bird that's been badly processed or not well packaged. When that's all under your control, you need the skill to do it right, or you'll start to lose those customers real quick. You also bear all the food safety liability, and in particular, finding an insurance policy that will cover this activity for some ranchers can be difficult and expensive. So researching that is an important piece before you start cutting into any chickens or turkeys. Also, state law and federal law don't always agree, and there are ways in which the laws actually limit the number of birds that you can process, where you can sell those birds, and additionally, whether or not you can hire employees, which gets to this idea of scale. You might be able to get underway, but law may prevent you from hiring employees in order to really grow that business. So again, not right for everyone, but it can be an opportunity to step outside of that sort of traditional inspected pathway, bring product to market as a complement to other ranch enterprises. If we go to the next one, I don't think I have time to get into the idea of retail exempt cut and wrap, but certainly in this time, we are seeing that processing at the slaughter end is not the only bottleneck that's suffering under COVID, but also access to cut and wrap services. There is a pathway for ranchers to take a USDA slaughtered carcass and break that down themselves for consumer sales. And, you know, like Larry said, I'm not that hard to find. So if folks want to explore this as an opportunity for the ranchers they work with, I'm happy to talk about it. Just a last note, if you go to the next slide, we have a website here called growninmarin.org that's got pretty comprehensive resources for ranchers. There's a page on each of these that we keep, and each of those pages, if you just click forward, each of these pages open up to a lot of further detail and other resources related to these business models in particular. So that's a link that folks may want to explore. And that's it for me.
Well, thanks so much, Vince. We appreciate it. And Dan, as well as Larry, if we could have the three of you come back on. At this time, we're going to ask a couple questions of our participants to see if they got some new information out of the webinar and all of that. And if folks on the line have some questions for our panelists, the appropriate thing to do is to go into the Q&A part, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can type a question in for our panelists. At this point, I'm putting in the link for today's resource kit, which has a summation of all the links provided by our panelists today. So folks can grab that if they'd like it for future reference. And I'll start out with a question in case none of our attendees have. You know, we had the conversation, I believe it was Dan who said something about, you know, maybe perhaps our food system could be a little different for these smaller scale operations. And I'm real curious what all three of you think about the future of our food system and how there could be some kind of cooperative or alliance or some kind of formation either geographically or across regional areas that would enhance the economic well-being for folks who have, you know, not 10 loads to take to market.
So from my perspective, there has to be enough financial incentive for a producer to want to do this. And from my perspective, $50 a head isn't enough money for me to take that kind of risk and put out that kind of effort. I could go cut a cord of firewood and sell it for $200 and only have half of a Saturday tied up and no risk. So what I see in our current system is it's more efficient to use California land to grow higher value crops than forages and grains. And because of the cost of fuel and transportation and centralized feeding, it's economically more efficient to send those cattle to the Midwest, feed them, process them, and send them back in a refrigerated truck. So until I see where there's, you know, significant economic incentive to participate, I don't see wholesale change.
Dan?
You know, I think looking at small ruminants as opposed to cattle, there are probably some differences just in terms of where we can market. The fact that we do have access to one of the largest markets for lamb and goat meat in the U.S. here on the West Coast, as well as the largest processor just down the road in Dixon. That said, I think the fact that we have despite numerous attempts to figure out how to build a small scale, locally focused USDA inspected cut and wrap or slaughter and cut and wrap facility, and yet we've not yet built one, suggests that maybe we need to think about the economics and the regulatory approach to meat, and maybe we need to collaborate or cooperate more so on the marketing and sales end of things than necessarily on the processing end of things. I do think there's some value in perhaps more collaboration at the production level as opposed to the processing level.
What do you think, Vince?
I think it was Larry in his presentation where he talked about the importance of knowing the difference between markets, and I think the question of whether or not this can make sense and how it might make sense going forward is really going to depend on where a rancher operates and where they're looking to sell. Certainly, I think the marketplace and the potential return on investment is going to be different in the counties immediately adjacent to big urban areas than as you push further and further out. And so I think that needs to be part of the calculus. But in terms of how things might shift to make this work going forward, I do think that Dan's point about collaboration around marketing is a good one. Most ranchers I know don't do this because they like to sling meat in the public square. A lot of them do it because they take a lot of pride in their relationship to their animals and the land. And so offloading some of that responsibility into a cooperative environment or with partners who are better at and more inclined to doing it is, I think, a really important avenue for ranchers to explore. It holds within it the potential to where the economics work for direct marketing, to take advantage of those economics, but without doing it in a way that ranchers burn out on the process.
Yeah, it's energy intensive, labor intensive of the own individual's labor to get that job done. We're going to continue with the question that we have that popped up in the Q&A. And while we're doing that, we're also going to run through a series of questions through the slide deck. And we're asking for participants' feedback on those questions. And the way you do that is you open up your chat box and you can type in A1 for Q1. If you have an answer you'd like to contribute, or as Lynn said at the beginning of the webinar, we're trying to think about how to reimagine our food system and what can we do through the University of California in order to improve the resiliency of our food system, whether that's bundling information we have already and sharing it, or whether it's doing research to develop new information to be shared. So we have a series of questions and we're looking for your input. So please feel free as we go through these questions, if they speak to you, to open up the chat box and provide some input. We thank you for that. With that, Julia Van Solen Kim has a question for us. Given the high cost of these products, what ideas have you heard of that make the products financially accessible to low-income consumers while we're ensuring that the ranchers get paid? So Dan has indicated he's interested in answering that one. Go for it. And if anybody else has a response as well, feel free after Dan.
I think this is a really critical question, and I'm glad you've asked it. I think I don't think there is an easy answer to it. I know that there's been some work here in the foothills some time ago to obtain grant funding that could provide some offset on the cost and make some of these products available to lower income folks. I think at the same time, what often, at least what happened in my experience, was that producers were asked to donate a certain amount of product to offset the cost and to make product available. And at the point where that request was made of me, we were trying to make our living full-time off of sheep. And I was making less money 30 years out of college than I made in my first job out of college trying to be in the sheep business. And I think that's kind of the conundrum that we find ourselves in terms of value and access to these products. I don't think grants are a long-term sustainable way to deal with it. But I think there are lots of costs that we've externalized in this system that are difficult to account for or to cover. It's kind of a non-answer, I realize, but it's a really tough question.
I'll just jump in there. I think that one avenue that is just, I think, starting to be better understood is the idea of quantifying the value that the animals on the land bring to communities through environmental benefits, and being able to compensate ranchers on that end. So right now, a cut of meat bears all the cost for the rancher's work, but the rancher's work in partnership with the animal has value beyond just what sits on the plate. And so efforts to really work with markets around carbon credits and environmental services, ways of bringing revenue that represents the value from having those animals on the land back to the rancher, completes a whole picture that can bring the overall cost of the meat down. Just as we've externalized some of the costs of our food system, we have failed to bring some of the value of elements of production back to the producers. And I think this emphasis to work with policymakers and other organizations to bring some of that value in can be an important way of bringing the overall cost of the product down.
I maybe have a little different thought, and I'm really glad I went to a Fall River Big Valley Cattlemen's meeting last night, or I'd have no answer. And it was kind of funny. I was chatting with the president, Tom Azevedo, last evening, and we got to talking about cuts of meat. And he said, my favorite, and everybody makes fun of me, is cuts from the chuck. And I thought about that, and I said, you know, that's because your wife can cook. And there's nothing like coming in on a cold, rainy, miserable day where it's dark early, and there's been, you know, you can smell a slow cooked pot roast in the oven. And I think we probably need to do more to make folks understand the value of some of those less expensive cuts. And I think there's probably some opportunity there where it doesn't have to be a New York steak. And I'm actually kind of curious to go back and ask our CalFresh coordinator, what do we got out there in the way of recommendations associated with some of these meat products?
So that's a cross section of answers. And at the end of the day, we have a food system that can produce food. It may not be able to get to market. And if it gets to market, it may not be accessible to the entire population of California for a variety of reasons at the local level, at the regional scale, whether it's grown in California, where it's whether it's brought in from out of state. And so, we continue to have questions, I guess, on how do we try to reframe the food system we have in order to do a better job at providing healthy, nutritious food to the whole population. And it's a big question. It really is a big question. And I'm populating our Q&A. We've had some feedback. Thank you, Rebecca, to get some feedback on the questions. I think one of the comments that was made, and perhaps I think it was Dan who said it, that we sometimes leave the processors out of our research questions. And given who we all are, sometimes we also leave out those doing the marketing. And there's part of our food system that we don't necessarily interact with directly because we're focused on production, or we're focused on environment, or we're focused on something else. And so, the big question is, are there other community partners perhaps that we could work with? And, I really appreciate Vince's comment about if the animal is bearing the whole burden of if the carcass and the sale of meat is bearing the whole burden for profitability for the animal, and those animals are doing great things for our environment, then maybe we need some other more creative payment. Because, we're California, we know fire season is here, and we also know the ruminants do a really good job helping reduce the fuel load out on all our hills and all our pasture lands and our rangelands. So the question is, maybe that's a conversation for our food system that we need to think about. And perhaps previously it's just been a conversation of how to manage natural resources, but maybe that conversation needs to also be part of the food system conversation for us.
Deanne, I think that's an excellent point. When I talk to community college groups, I talk about the miracle of the ruminant animal and the fact that we can use ruminants to do things that no other animal, including the human animal, can do. And I think that's part of the bigger picture in my perspective.
Yeah, and it's not just the ruminant. I mean, certainly you're well aware of the ability to use mule power to remove down trees out of our forests, to get in where equipment would be perhaps too damaging, or just it's not accessible, or it's cost prohibitive. And of course, using mule power, which would be a four-legged mule with a human attached at some point, for those who aren't familiar with it. But, to do that, it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of knowledge and know-how. So, I think we have some things to consider as we talk about the resilience of our food system, and perhaps where other components that should be brought front and center while we're talking about our food system. So I certainly want to thank all three of you today. You've provided wonderful information. We appreciate the ability to have the link, and we did drop the link into the chat box for where to find all of your resources available on this subject. And also in that resource kit is everybody's contact information. So thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to prepare and present today. And coming in 2 weeks from today, same time, same location, folks can pre-register. We'll have a second installment on the beef supply chain and market disruptions during COVID-19. And we're looking forward to that one as well. It's quite different than this one. The commonality would be the ruminant animal. So everybody stay safe and enjoy what's for dinner tonight. Thank you very much.